for joining us. I'm Gail Rosenthal from the Sara and Sam Schoffer Holocaust Resource Center at Stockton University. Thank you again so much for joining us. We know that we will have well over 100 participants, breaking some of our records maybe for April already. I want to introduce to you Dr. Michael Hayes, who is going to speak to you about one of our projects, Holocaust Survivors of South Jersey, and then introduce to you our special speaker for this evening, Seth Stern. In the chat, you may pose a question to Irvin Marino Rodriguez. Just look for the name Irvin, I-R-V-I-N. And at the end of the presentation, we have devoted about 20 minutes for questions for Seth. So I can see him smiling right in front of me from the Washington area, because he's so happy to see so many of you, because he remembers his childhood days visiting the chicken farm, where his poultry farm, where his grandparents lived. So Michael, would you begin our presentation, please? And first tell us about the project, Holocaust Survivors of South Jersey. Some of us want to make sure that we're part of the project, and then to introduce Seth Stern. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gail. First of all, can you hear me? I'm Michael Hayes. I'm the Wally Lutz Hammerschlag Holocaust and Genocide Studies Associate Professor of Holocaust Studies at Stockton University. It's hard to fit on a card. I have been overseeing for the past more than 3 years the project, the Holocaust Survivors of South Jersey. As many of you know, I really want to focus on Seth tonight and his great, wonderful new book. But if any of you want, anybody in the audience would like information to check whether the Holocaust survivors that you know or that you're related to are in our project, if we've already identified them and done research on them or told their stories, then please contact us. We will be putting the information, both the website and the email address in the chat. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about that tonight, but it's an exciting project. We now have 1,635 Holocaust survivors, and I know there are hundreds more that we have not yet fully documented, and so we would love your help to identify the remaining Holocaust survivors and fully document their stories. But really tonight is a celebration of a great new book. As somebody who has published books before, it's like birthing a child with a little less pain, but it takes a lot longer. So Seth Stern has been working many years on this book, which is both personal and important historically. And so, Seth, I'd like to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Your book came out about 2 weeks ago, and so it's very fresh off the presses. And so, if we could, Seth Stern is a legal journalist with Bloomberg News in Washington, D.C. He's a legal journalist, so this isn't the type of book that sort of is in his normal, shall we say, lane, but it is definitely in his personal sort of field of vision. So Seth, your book, which I will hold up here again, we had it up before, the Speaking Yiddish to Chickens, just came out. Holocaust Survivors on South Jersey Poultry Farms is something that with our project we've been working on for many years. So how did you come across this project? I know it's personal to you.
Well, first, let me just thank you, Michael and Gail and Irvin, for hosting this, and for we first met during the pandemic, and you're generously sharing some of your data with me. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for hosting this. Speaking Yiddish to Chickens is the story of the roughly 1,000 Holocaust survivors who settled as poultry farmers in South Jersey, and it is a personal story for me. My grandparents were among those survivors who settled on a farm, and it's where my mother grew up. The title, Speaking Yiddish to Chickens, comes from the idea that in oral histories, so many of these survivors joked that part of the appeal was that the chickens didn't mind if you spoke Yiddish to them. And that reflected the fact that these survivors came to the United States as displaced persons. They didn't know much, if any, English. Most had very little money. Their educations had been interrupted by the war. And so they didn't have great prospects necessarily in New York at the time when they arrived, or whatever other big cities they first arrived in. And there was great appeal, tremendous appeal in the idea of being your own boss after years of captivity or confinement. And so, at least initially, they saw this as a real opportunity when they saw an ad, as was the case for my grandparents, in a Yiddish newspaper in New York, or more likely through word of mouth, when one survivor told another about the opportunity and the chance to get help from the Jewish Agricultural Society. Whether the sort of hard life that ensued matched what their vision might have been at the outset's a different question that we'll talk about.
All right. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your grandparents? That's on your maternal side, I believe, your mother's parents, right?
Yeah, this is the story. Well, in part of the story is personal, part is broader, but my grandparents, Nuchem and Branya Green, they were born and grew up in Lublin, Poland. They survived the war hiding in a forest, living underground. They came out of the war and lived as displaced persons at a DP camp in Germany, and then came to the United States in early 1947, and after a few months in New York, wound up on the poultry farm.
Mm-hmm. And do you remember visiting the poultry farm?
Well, no. My grandparents and my mother left in 1964 when my mother graduated high school, and I wasn't born until more than a decade later. But I certainly heard about the farm, and this sort of the beginnings of this project in 1998, when I was in law school. I started interviewing my grandmother about her life experience, and the part of the story that really fascinated me the most, perhaps, was how did all of these survivors, most of whom grew up in big cities or mid-sized cities in Eastern Europe, almost none of whom had experience as farmers, how did they wind up on these South Jersey farms? So I continued to interview her and my mom, and broadened that out to other survivors and their children, and did archival research, relied on oral histories. And I do want to say that this book simply wouldn't have been possible without the many survivors, and particularly their children, who were so generous with their time, with their memories, with their photos, welcoming me into their homes, answering questions on Zoom during the pandemic. So it's not an overstatement to say I simply couldn't have done this without all of their help.
Well, that's a great question that leads me into the one about the research. As a historian, I know how important sources are, and that we sort of go to the ends of the earth, literally, to figure out where are the documents that we can use to tell the story, to sort of, and so I know this is a multi-year project. You must have spent at least a decade working on this book. So what are the sort of sources, in addition to the discussions with people in Vineland who were second generation, that you used for this book?
Well, I approached this as my primary profession as a journalist, and I guess on the side, an amateur historian, perhaps. So looking at it from both perspectives. So relying on interviews and oral histories, but sort of also acknowledging their limitations and looking for more contemporaneous sources. So the records of the Jewish Agricultural Society, for instance, at the Center for Jewish History in New York. My family, they were assisted by the United Service for New Americans, one of the agencies, along with HIAS, that helped a lot of the survivors when they came over. And I was able to get their case file. And that allowed me to really get a sense of what those early months were like in New York, and exactly why they wound up on viewing a farm as so appealing. And that's through the notes of the caseworker. I looked at the newspaper, the Vineland Times Journal, spent a lot of weekends in the Vineland Public Library, just going through the microfilm there before it was mercifully digitized, and I was able to do that from home. The Jewish Farmer was a monthly magazine in Yiddish and English published by the Jewish Agricultural Society. And The Poultryman was a local, a national poultry trade publication published in Vineland. So I read through that. A lot of this was all available at Rutgers or the Center for Jewish History.
Wow, I mean, it's really amazing because, for our project, we're working on many of the same sources. And again, I have to, just as you've thanked people, I have to thank you for sharing your research with us. My students have benefited, the project has benefited. So one of the things that strikes me that I'd like you to comment on as well is that Vineland was a Vineland in particular, Cumberland County, Vineland, New Jersey, was a unique place in the early post-war period, where Holocaust survivors, as well as many other immigrants, new Americans, sort of settled, and where poultry farming became a thing, was, it's just fascinating. And so if you could tell us a little bit about what you think of Vineland now that you've become familiar with it from your research, from the stories that your family has told, sort of what should we know about that?
Well, Vineland, I'll go back even to its founding, was sort of a unique place. Charles Landis, the founder and visionary, it was almost a precursor to modern suburban planning, where he plotted very carefully where the houses could go and the trees and these straight street grids, and his vision of factories mingling with farms. And initially it was the people who came first were Italian-American immigrants, and they largely were growing fruits and vegetables on truck farms. Poultry farming emerged a little later, closer to the turn of the century. But the other element that was so unique about Vineland was this as a place in rural Jewish America, where you had really three waves. First, the Eastern European immigrants, very idealistic. They came and formed collective agricultural colonies in South Jersey, the most famous being at Alliance. And as time went on, the colonies weren't tremendously successful, but some of those people migrated to Vineland, whether for better jobs or education for their kids, and created a very robust Jewish community there. And that was supplemented in the late 30s and early 40s by the next wave, which were the German and Austrian refugees, some of the first to get out, and with the help of the Jewish Agricultural Society, were able to settle on poultry farms in the area. And so by the time the survivors came after the war, there was this, as I said, a robust Jewish community, multiple synagogues, kosher butcher shops and delis and bakeries. There was a Jewish radio show, and then a second on Sundays. There was multiple Zionist organizations. And this came at a time, it was growing, this Jewish community in Vineland, at a time when most rural Jewish communities were starting to shrink. There were always Jewish rural communities, Jews sort of, whether it was in Appalachia or Gold Rush, California, the Mississippi Delta, they came as peddlers selling whatever they could carry and then opening dry goods stores. So Vineland wasn't unique to have a Jewish presence, but it was unique in that it was still growing in the 1950s, whereas the case was in much else of rural America, those communities were shrinking. People were moving to cities, Jews were moving from cities to suburbs. So it really was a unique place.
It really was. And according to our research on this, Holocaust Survivors of South Jersey project, more than three-quarters, almost exactly, but slightly more than three-quarters of the Holocaust survivors who settled in South Jersey lived on chicken farms, right? I thought that when I started the research, it would be, a certain minority, but important minority, but of the Holocaust survivors. But that's really astounding, right?
It is astounding. And I would say certainly at the outset, some of them found it just not to their liking at all and didn't last long. Some lasted years or a decade or more. So there were differences in longevity for sure. But it was, and I wondered that, why South Jersey? Besides the fact that there was this robust existing Jewish community. The other piece of it was there were other Jewish farming communities. The Jewish Agricultural Society had long given up on collective farming. That just didn't work. And they supported individual family farms. Where it worked best tended to be near existing Jewish communities. So places like the Berkshires, the Catskills, central New Jersey, Toms River, Farmingdale, for instance. But those places were getting too expensive. So by the time the German and Austrian refugees needed a place to buy a farm, it was viewed, South Jersey, as a cheaper alternative to, maybe it was more appealing for people to live in central or northern New Jersey, so you were closer to New York City, but farms were cheaper in South Jersey. So that's why the Jewish Agricultural Society really directed the largest number to there.
Mm-hmm. And they also had the markets, I think, of Philadelphia and New York that weren't too far away, right? That was very important. In the research on your book. Okay, one of the things I love about your book, I have to say, there are many things I like about your book, and I encourage everybody to get a copy, is the personal stories that you tell. You know, there are those people who really succeeded. This was an opportunity that many people took advantage of, but they came as non-farmers. They had no, you know, many of them were professionals back in Europe before they came over, and they ended up on a chicken farm, you know, founding new families, you know, becoming, you know, successful in their own ways, those who succeeded at least. In your research, what are some of the stories that really stand out?
Well, there's so many stories that stand out. I think what is remarkable to me is that this is a people who had suffered so much and experienced personal trauma and loss, and they come over and they are sort of thrust into just completely foreign and alien environment. For most of them, rural life was a culture shock for many. If not rural life, then certainly the idea of poultry farming. And the way in which they adapted to it as a way to make a living, which wasn't easy. This was tough work just on a daily basis. You had to wake up early, make sure the chickens had water and the water hadn't frozen, and the chickens had to eat all day. And if you couldn't afford an automatic feeder yet, it meant hauling 50-pound bags all day around in your coops. And the chicken waste was all over, and the smell and the feathers. I mean, it was unpleasant, and the birds could be very unpleasant. And it was a tough business. You were sort of subject to the whims of the markets and weather and the chicken's health, and they'd smother each other to death and peck each other to death. So it was hard, and yet they persevered, and they formed this very special bond in a community. They had their own sheeblech. They built their own little shuls within walking distances of their farms, and they built what's called a Landsmannschaft, a sort of hybrid mutual aid society and social club, which they ultimately called the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, and it hosted Passover dances and Purim parties for the kids, and Yiddish performers from New York, poets and playwrights and comedians, and just an amazing ability to create their own community. So I think that's sort of the collective story rather than an individual story.
Right. No, it's a great story too. It's also an American story. And I think that's important. Vineland was a fascinating place because in my research, I'm not from New Jersey. I'm not from the Vineland area or South Jersey area. But one of the things I find very fascinating about South Jersey, and particularly Vineland in this era, is how multicultural it was. There were many immigrant groups. And what sort of do you take away from how the relationships were between the various different immigrant groups? There were Germans, there were Poles, but there were especially Italian Americans and Jewish Americans, Holocaust survivors, most importantly, of course. And so what strikes you about this sort of mix of different cultures in a place like Vineland in southern New Jersey?
It was very important to me to try to get at those dynamics, the dynamics among the various Jewish groups, what were referred to as sort of the American Jews, the descendants of the original colonists. And then you had the German and Austrian. The nickname was Yekkes, and then the survivors, the nickname was the Grine for the Eastern European ones. And so there were dynamics just between them, and the differences in the sense that both of the refugee waves felt that they weren't welcome, and we could talk more about that, and kept to themselves in terms of where they prayed or how they socialized. And so those dynamics played out. And then, as you said, there was the more dominant or predominant community was the Italian American, the descendants of the original farmers. And by the 50s, the mayors were Italian. A lot of the business owners and professionals were Italian American. And there were stories that I recount in the book of, there were instances of anti-Semitism and some conflict, but there were also just unbelievable instances of Italian Americans helping some of the survivors, helping them transport their animals to get slaughtered in a kosher way, or making sure they could get to a synagogue to say Yortzeit for the relatives they lost, or taking them to the hospital in Philadelphia when a child was sick. So there's a range of both, I would say, conflict, and the relationship among the Jewish communities or sub communities. It was complex. It was definitely complex.
I think definitely complex is a good term. So let's talk about that complexity. So many of the Holocaust survivors who arrived after the war, especially those who arrived after the war, often faced, I don't know how to put this, but sort of, they didn't feel particularly welcome. And I was wondering if you'd speak to that as you do.
Yeah. That was certainly the perception of many, but not all, that they were not welcome. They heard comments that were at best sort of insensitive. How come you wound up with a tattoo on your arm? Only prisoners have tattoos on their arm. Why were you in a camp? Only, who winds up in a camp except bad people? And they felt unwelcome, and to a large extent, that's why they kept to themselves at first. I try to unpack to what extent this was the earlier waves of Jewish generations they felt threatened by the newcomers. They were trying to become fully American themselves and didn't want people with accents pointing out, to others that, hey, Jews are different. Did they try their best and simply say the wrong thing? Because who knew how to say the right thing to people who had experienced unfathomable horrors? Was it the survivors' own sense of insecurity that kept them away? I don't have the right conclusion, but what's certainly true is the German Jews similarly felt unwelcome, similarly kept to themselves. And that was true with the new arrivals, even though they had that connection. Both had lost so much in relatives killed and their possessions, their professions. But those two communities also kept to themselves. The German Jews had their own synagogues. They had their own social club, the Poultrymen's Club, and the same held true with most of the Eastern European Jews after the war.
Mm-hmm. And in that respect, can you put your own grandparents in sort of that context of what their experience was?
Yeah, they were firmly in the camp. That their memories, my mother's recollections, were of feeling unwelcome and feeling more comfortable keeping to themselves, their fellow Polish Jews, and speaking Yiddish, in gravitating to card games, in their case poker, with fellow Polish Jews, or speaking Polish or Yiddish while you played cards. They were involved in the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, and they sort of gravitated to the stretch along the Morris River known as Alliance or Norma Beach, which was one of the survivors' sons said was their Riviera, was their place to socialize, and and so they were very much part of that survivor community.
Mm-hmm. And so tell us a little bit more about your grandparents, sort of what, they came to Vineland when, they left when.
Yeah, they were among some of the first arrivals. They came in December of '47. They purchased a farm. They purchased it jointly with one of my grandmother's closest childhood friends, had survived the war, in her case, passing as a Pole and hiding and she met her husband after the war. He had survived Majdanek among other experiences, and so they had their daughters were born almost within weeks of each other. They went to the DP camp together in Germany. They came over on the same ship, the Marine Perch, and they decided to go it together. The Jewish Agricultural Society really discouraged joint partnerships that tended to go very badly. A lot of acrimony, people who had very little in common besides a common desire for a farm. It just didn't go well. In my family's case, they cohabitated essentially as one family, raising their daughters as twins for more than 4 years. It wasn't easy to have a 3-bedroom house for two families and try to navigate two families in one home and sort of 2 coops. It wasn't easy, but they did it, and that's a friendship that's endured to this day with my mother and her childhood friend.
Wow, that's great. Yes, because there were many stories that didn't turn out so happily, shall we say. But since you touched on the subject, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the sort of leisure. You write about that in your book. What, not just the Holocaust survivors, and that they tended to gravitate toward one another because they understood one another. They had similar experience, or at least they could understand what the others had gone through. But the second generation, the people who were born after the war, was a unique community, and the people I've spoken to are really fascinating. They got stories to tell. So what was Vineland like for people who grew up after the war as children, and what was family life like?
Yeah, I think it was unique in many respects in terms of compared to most survivors who wound up in big cities, particularly New York. To grow up in Vineland was a rural childhood. It was a mix, in my mother's memories in particular, sort of the idyllic and the dangerous. The picture she still has on her shelf of holding the little baby chicks. They were soft and fluffy until they got older and were much more unpleasant, and sort of the dangerous, where she remembers my grandfather having a rifle to shoot the wild animals who would come and could kill hundreds of chickens before you knew it. So, but being able to, this was a real distinction between growing up in New York or other big cities. You were growing up on a 10-acre farm, which was not paradise. You were sharing it with 3,000, 5,000 hens. But the space, to have that kind of physical space and just the natural surroundings, playing in the creeks or just having the ability to sort of ride your bike, the notion of survivors is very overprotective. The reality was these survivors were so busy farming, they couldn't watch their children every minute. So their kids had a lot of freedom to explore the natural world. And so it was different in those respects. And there was this desire by the parents to make sure their kids got the music lessons that they might have had as kids or might have missed because of the war, and make sure their kids were American. In my mother's case, making sure she had piano lessons and joined a Girl Scout troop, or for boys, if it was a Boy Scout troop, or playing playing Little League baseball. So there was elements of a very Jewish survivor world, the sort of Yiddish events and the Purim parties, and then there was the very American Little League games and Girl Scout troops.
Yeah, no, that's actually fascinating too. You mentioned earlier on the story of the radio show, the Yiddish radio program, and for me, that's been something of great fascination. So, could you tell us a little bit about that? What you learned?
There were actually two Jewish radio programs. One dated back to the 40s, The Voice of Israel, and those were, I don't know if you want to call them the American Jews, and it was a mix of very much sort of with a Zionist flavor to it, especially after the birth of Israel in 48. And that program persisted in the 50s and into the 60s. Ultimately, some of the survivors' children would serve as hosts of the program in the 60s. The other program was Yiddish, a good Volk, I'm going to mispronounce it, a good week, by Mr. Kupova, I'm going to mispronounce his name too, Mr. Kupavasser, created the program, I believe, in the late 50s or 60, and he unfortunately passed away by the mid 60s. And that program, I think, got absorbed by the other. But yeah, for a time, you had two different Jewish radio programs in this rural city of 30,000 people in southern New Jersey.
Right, and one of them was even in Yiddish, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
So much of the cultural life of the survivors was in Yiddish. Mr. Kupavasser also had a newsletter that was mostly in Yiddish. The meetings of the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, they spoke Yiddish there. The card games at the beach at Norma Beach. I mean, it was a blend. Some spoke Polish, Hungarian, or whatever other language they might have grown up with. But Yiddish was sort of this common bond. And certainly the performers that they welcomed to Vineland, who often themselves were displaced persons and were essentially reduced to going wherever the remnants of Eastern European Jewry had scattered, would perform there. And for them, it was a touching experience. It was standing room only, sold out crowds, hundreds of people packing Vineland High School or the Reber School, or those were the only venues that could fit that many people. So for them, it was a pretty remarkable experience too.
Mm-hmm. No, that is amazing. And so since we're also talking about all that cultural experience, I mean, one of the things that you write about and that I have really been fascinated with is the emphasis, of course, on the children. Right, as Holocaust survivors sort of restarted their lives, began sort of building their families, one of their most important sort of focuses was on the success of their children. And what they did. So in terms of that intergenerational sort of support, sort of what are some of the most important things that we should know about that?
Well, I don't think that's at all unique to the survivors in South Jersey, the farming survivors. I mean, the same held true equally elsewhere. In terms, as I mentioned, it was very important for them to have the cultural exposure, even though they might have been in a rural place. It was important for them to sort of become American, fully American, even if the survivors themselves weren't necessarily fully comfortable and kept one foot or more than 1 foot in the sort of the culture they had from growing up. So that was very important. Education was certainly important to them. And I'm not a social scientist. I didn't try to study and quantify differences in outcomes. But by all accounts, it doesn't seem that the survivors' children were any worse off for having grown up in a place like South Jersey on farms rather than in big cities. You look at their career trajectories in terms of education and entering professions and business and academia. So many of them did very well. Hardly any, if any, wound up farming, given we could talk about the trajectory of the poultry business. But I think that would have been the case even if poultry was a success. I think the survivors shared the same aspirations as all other American Jews, that their children would move on to professions and become business owners, or so that they didn't necessarily want their children to stay farmers, even if the farms were successful, which they weren't in the long term.
Right. Well, since you raised that farms weren't successful in the long term, I mean, it's really important to remember that this was really a moment in time when farms provided a good living for a family, selling eggs. So could you tell me about what that trajectory is, that history?
Well, certainly at the outset, I would say, there was the notion, as I said, of the appeal of being your own boss. And as I said, the reality was different. You were sort of beholden to the market, the weather, the chicken's health. So it didn't quite offer the control they would have hoped for. And they learned that very quickly, probably as soon as they got in the coops for a few days. But as a business, initially things went pretty well. There were still price supports after World War II. And then with the Korean War starting in 1950, the price of eggs went up. Soldiers needed protein. Factory workers had more money in their pockets. So for a while in the early 50s, things were going pretty well. But by the mid-50s, the price of eggs started dropping, and that continued to be the case through the decade. The timing was essentially terrible. There were structural changes in the poultry industry, as in every other part of American agriculture in the decades that followed, where the scale where you could be a successful egg farmer with 3,000 hens or 5,000 hens in the 40s, the scale went up to 25,000, 50,000, 100,000, and ultimately a million, as in the case of one of the big egg kings of California was actually a survivor. He had 1 million hens, stinking up an entire county by all accounts with his chicken waste. But that was the scale of agriculture, and these farmers who didn't have the sort of capital to do that, they just simply couldn't compete. So as the 50s went on, more and more of them, they might have tried to find an ancillary business of poultry vaccines or processing kosher chicken or broken eggs that they could sell in tin cans to bakeries, or have an egg route to sort of sell directly to businesses or restaurants. Or they found other businesses opening a motel. Well, as you well know, you've certainly been studying all the range of other opportunities they pursued. So some stayed in the area and tried to make a living in other ways, and some just gave up on South Jersey and scattered throughout the country.
No, that's exactly what we've been finding as well as we do continue our research on the project. One of the things that I'm constantly fascinated with as well is sort of this idea of sort of interethnic relationships. And one place where that comes up, and you've got that in your book as well, I'm happy to say, is that to run a farm, you need farmhands, right? And many of the farmhands were Hispanic or Black. And there's some really fascinating stories about that, because you've got the European Jews who have survived so much trauma, lost so much, and they come over, they have their farms. And then they have to, of course, work with farmhands. And there's so many very complex stories there. And I was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about what your research uncovered.
Sure. The farmers, they couldn't do all the work themselves, even if both husband and wife on a farm were working. And often that wasn't possible because one or the other had to find a way to supplement their income. In my grandmother's case and so many others, that meant working in one of the clothing factories in Vineland. But even with the help of the spouse and maybe even children as they were teenagers, they still needed extra labor, but they didn't have the kind of money to hire really high quality labor. And what they wound up relying on were these agencies in Baltimore and Philadelphia who would often send over men who, in many cases, down on the luck, often alcoholics. They would be given $1 and a bus ticket and wind up in Vineland, and the farmers would complain about them disappearing or stealing, or in some cases becoming violent. The farmhands, the conditions weren't exactly great for them. They were living in coops or rooms off of coops, and like all other circumstances, this was a difficult dynamic for both. As you mentioned, there was the sort of layered on that, on top of that, the racial dimension. Some of them were Black, others were Puerto Rican. So you had a wave of Puerto Rican migration to the truck farms. Initially, they came to help pick the fruits and vegetables in South Jersey under contracts. And some of them sort of left those arrangements and wound up on the poultry farms. Some had very fond memories of their experiences, and some didn't. So on both sides, it was a difficult relationship.
Hello, Dr. Hayes. This is your 5-minute warning.
Okay, thank you very much. I still have so many questions. So Vineland was also a special place as the egg capital, really, of at least the mid-Atlantic, if not the whole East Coast. And so what did you learn as you were researching this topic about just sort of the sort of power and the aura of the egg industry?
It's hard to imagine now that at this time in the 1950s, 1 in 5 eggs in the New York market, in the metropolitan New York market, came from Jersey. The same held true, if not higher, in Philadelphia. The character of Vineland, the local football team at the high school, was the poultry clan. The sort of landscape was dominated by the feed mills and the silos for the feed. So sort of the landscape was dominated, and you had the hatcheries and the vaccine places and the feed stores. So it was very much so central. And the Jewish immigrants, across these generations, played such a central role in it, and the survivors in particular in the 50s. And their role was so little known outside of South Jersey. I talk in the book about a couple things. Manischewitz opened a plant in Vineland in the mid-50s, and they were manufacturing borscht and gefilte fish, and they took out ads in Jewish newspapers throughout the country, sort of boasting that their gefilte fish was made with Vineland eggs. But they didn't mention who was exactly making, who was raising those Vineland eggs. The most famous product of South Jersey's egg industry was a chicken named Meg O'Day. In 1957, she broke world records for the number of consecutive days of laying eggs. And this was in papers around the world. Again, so you had a chicken, and she was raised by the Sterns, who were a Jewish hatchery in Vineland, but they weren't survivors. So the chicken was so famous, but the survivors weren't. And there is a contrast between sort of their invisibility in the larger world, but yet in Vineland there was a great deal of visibility, in part because another story I try to tell is the publishing family of the Vineland Times Journal, the Luchter family, just exhibited tremendous compassion in how they wrote about the survivors and gave them great visibility within the community. There was a sense or perception, certainly at the time, that or in the decades that followed, that survivors were ignored, that there wasn't attention given to them. And some of that's been challenged by more recent scholarship. But certainly in Vineland at the time, they were given a great deal of attention and prominence and weren't treated like they were invisible.
Yes, and maybe that's the last question I'll ask before we turn to questions from the audience. And that really is this centrality of the sort of Jewish community and survivors in particular in the cultural and media landscape of Vineland, right? And the Luchters are a big part of that. It reminds me over and over again when I do research how important those local newspapers are that were of such high quality, reporting on everything that took place in the community, but not, and so I'm wondering, since you did so much research, obviously starting earlier than I did, if you could comment on how that all came about and how important that was.
That's something that strikes me as a journalist by profession. The importance of those local newspapers, in this case, the Vineland paper, and to some extent, some of the other ones in Bridgeton and Cherry Hill and Atlantic City and their coverage. And just what's lost now as you see the sort of disintegration of local papers as a chronicle in real time to share so that other people in the community understand each other. But then also for future historians, I don't think looking at Facebook pages and TikTok videos are going to give the same rich detail. So I think something is very much lost, and it is unfortunate, and maybe in part because I am a journalist, to see the death of those local journalistic outlets.
Thank you, Seth. Irvin, I believe we have some questions from the audience. Is that correct?
Hi, Dr. Hayes. Yes, we do. The first question that I will actually answer is, will this video be recorded? Yes. This video is being recorded and will be published on our Sara and Sam Schoffer Holocaust Resource Center website, as well as our YouTube channel. So I've actually placed that link to our YouTube channel in the Zoom chat box, and the video will be available in approximately 3 weeks. There is a editing process to the videos as well as closed captioning. So it'll take about 3 weeks to be published on our YouTube channel and Holocaust Resource Center website. The first question, Seth, is why did you decide to write the book?
Well, I think initially, like I said, this dates back to 1998. I was about 23 years old. I think it was a way, like many grandchildren of survivors, wanting to understand their grandparents' experience, want to understand them better. And so at the outset, I think that was my goal, was just to be able to preserve my own family's history for our own family, and that's still very important to me. My grandmother passed away in 2014. My son was born a year later. He never met her, and so if no one else reads the book, I hope one day he's 7. I don't expect him to read it today, but one day I do hope that he reads it, and similarly my niece and nephew. So, but I do think at a certain point, I thought there was a broader story here, a story that hasn't been told, really. There's plenty of books about Jewish agriculture, a lot of books right behind me on the shelf about Jewish rural communities, but there hasn't really been a book that's tried to tell the story of the survivor farmers. And the largest concentration of them by far, was in South Jersey. So I thought there was a story to tell here, and that's why I broadened it out and tried to speak to many others, so that it wasn't just a story of my family, that I sort of gave a sense of the mosaic of survivor life and experiences there.
Thank you. And this is the most common question we've received this evening is, how can someone purchase your book?
Great question. So it is available now anywhere you might buy books online. I'm not going to choose favorites. I obviously support independent bookstores, and bookshop.org is a conduit to you be able to direct the proceeds towards the independent bookstore of your choice, but it's also available on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Powell's, or anywhere else you might want to shop.
And someone referenced Dr. Hayes's notion of writing a book at the beginning of the program. So someone in the community asked, what was your motivation? And how long did it take you to complete this book?
Well, my motivation certainly wasn't to make money. I mean, this is the definition of a labor of love. I started it 25 years ago. Other things got in the way. I wrote another book, have a family and my career at various points. But I've been working on this very seriously, not full time, but for the last 10 years. I think it's just a journalist or someone who I like writing, I like researching. I thought it was a story I wanted to tell, and you can't possibly, in economic terms, justify the number of hours that I've spent on it. But I'm so happy that I did.
Seth, I have to, before he asks the next question, I have to express my empathy for your situation. What it takes to bring a book into the world is much more than it takes to bring a child into the world.
Well,
not quite as rewarding.
Well, my wife might disagree with you there.
But yeah, so I have, your first book, I believe, was on Justice Brennan, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the connection, the only connection, is that he grew up in Newark, New Jersey. So I grew up on Long Island, but I've become an accidental New Jersey historian.
Although you live in Washington now.
And I live in Washington.
Right. Yes. So I have a book that I've been working on for going on 20 years now. And it's on hold because I'm so fascinated with the Holocaust survivors of South Jersey, and I've been working on that project. But it's like you said, labor of love. So back to you, Irvin.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Hayes. Seth, so a lot of people have also been asking to share another story that surprised you about a Holocaust survivor family who owned a poultry farm in Vineland. Others have also asked, like, what was the most surprising thing that you learned during your research?
I mean, there's so many stories of the families, and I very consciously, I don't want to single people out for better or worse. I see many of the people as we were coming into the Zoom, people I spoke to, and I appreciate, again, all your help. I guess one aspect of it that surprised me is, this may not be satisfying for everyone, but the Jewish Agricultural Society, and looking through their records and the ambivalence that they felt even from the outset in the 1940s at board meetings, saying, is this really the right solution for people in these people's situation? And they sort of swallowed their own ambivalence. And I think it was out of this ideological belief in Jewish farming, a belief that they just wanted to do something, anything possible to help survivors, that their prospects weren't necessarily better in big cities. But what struck me as time went on, as the 50s went on, the Jewish Agricultural Society stuck to this sort of, things are going to get better. Just around the corner, better times are ahead, even when that was just not at all congruent with reality or what anyone familiar with the trajectory of the poultry industry was. And whether it was just because they were so committed to it, it's because they had worked, many of them worked for decades for the Jewish Agricultural Society, that they stuck to it. That kind of surprised me. I guess I wish they all passed away long before I started this, but to be able to have a candid conversation and maybe ask, like, why didn't you try to just work more on transition, helping these people out of this situation? But that's a question that'll never be answered.
And we've had a couple of questions related to the process of tracking down Holocaust survivors and their children. Can you talk more about that process and what you did to locate these individuals? My
process was sort of multiple. So the Jewish Federation of what was then, I think, Cumberland County, had the foresight to do oral histories with a dozen or so. And I got a copy of those, and that was a great starting point. And I looked at telephone directories from the era, and I looked at the Jewish Agricultural Society's records in particular, was the best source because it showed who bought farms when, and cross-referencing those with phone books and obituaries in the local papers. And as so many newspapers got digitized, to be able to look at obituaries nationwide. So that was sort of the basis, and then reaching out to people and asking people I spoke with, well, who else should I speak with? And I ultimately spoke to about 80 or 90 different people, survivors, their children, or others involved in the poultry industry or Jewish community in South Jersey.
Okay. Thank you. And someone is asking, did you ever video record the interviews with Holocaust survivors or their children, and why, if you did not?
Well, I didn't, and I obviously regret that. I mean, when I started this video technology, it wasn't like you could just put up your iPhone. My grandmother, I don't think would have been comfortable doing that. I certainly talking about the war, but I just think in general, it would have made it more difficult to get her to talk if I had a camera in her face, particularly then when cameras were much bigger. With other survivors, again, I sort of approached this as a journalist. I just had my notepad and a pen. In hindsight, do I wish I had videotaped? Absolutely. But in the moment, I'm just trying to get the information. I'm not thinking, well, I've got to record this for posterity.
And I know we don't have too much time, and I apologize to everyone because we did have a number of questions go through the Zoom chat and comments. But Seth, what are the most important lessons that you've learned from your research that you want to share with us and our children and grandchildren?
I think the biggest lesson for me, and what I hope I convey in the book, is the notion of survivors as a mosaic. I think there's a tendency to typecast them, whether as all broken and ruined or all as just stories of triumph. And it's not either or. There was such a tremendous variation in how well they coped with the trauma they experienced, how much success they had in America, how much religious observance meant to them. And so I hope that that's something that comes across, is that they weren't a monolith and that there's a lot of variation. And I hope you can see that in this book.
Okay, thank you. And now I will pass it along to the director of the Sara and Sam Schoffer Holocaust Resource Center at Stockton University, Gail Rosenthal.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. I'm sorry if you had your hand raised, but our system here at Stockton is to use the chat for the questions or statements or whatever you want to share with all of us. Thank you for being well over 100 of our friends and neighbors joining us here this evening. Our next community-wide event for all in the community is our Yom HaShoah program, which will be in person at Beth El Synagogue. Also, it will be available on Zoom. Irvin just put links to the flyer and the Zoom link in the chat, where we'll be remembering so many of your parents and friends and neighbors. And of course, just check our Holocaust Resource Center website. And when the editing is done, this recording will be available, as well as check immediately if you'd like our Zoom link for Yom HaShoah. And so many of you put in the chat, could we hear one more goodbye, one more, whatever. We're gonna let Seth, our esteemed guest and scholar this evening, be our absolute closer. But Michael, is there anything you want to share with us at
Yes.
closing? And thank
Yes,
you
the only
all
thing
so
that I would,
much.
oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Gail. First, before he closes us out, I want to thank Seth for his really valuable research. This wonderful book. It is so readable. He writes so much better than I can imagine I can ever do. I really have to say, the journalism shows. But I want to thank everybody else who showed up and remind everyone, I see so many names on here of Holocaust, the surnames of our Holocaust survivors of South Jersey. And so if you have not yet gotten in touch with us, then please do so. I think that Irvin will put in the link to our website. Please contact us because we would like to hear from you to tell the story of your family. It is a long process. It's a lot of work, but we need your help with that. And again, it's that labor of love. So
Well, I would just thank you to Stockton for hosting this. Thank you for everyone who participated and helped so much along the way. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to, if you want to be in contact, yiddishtochickens@gmail.com. My Facebook page for the book is facebook.com/yiddishtochickens. And if you're wondering perhaps if you wanted to find information about your own family's records with the Jewish Agricultural Society or otherwise, I'm also happy to try to help direct you a little in that way as well. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your interest.